Hi. So the purpose of this short screencast is to discuss two elements of dramatic structure, in particular in Trifles. First of all, what is the exposition in Trifles? And we're going to come to the conclusion of some kind of a statement of dramatic action that shows us the basic arc of the plot. So the first thing we want to do is take another quick look at what a plot diagram looks like, remembering that the exposition is usually in the beginning, and it gives us background information about the character's backstory. The point of attack happens next, or the inciting incident, and that kickstarts the protagonist on their goals. Then rising action and complications happen that add suspense and take the protagonist on a journey that climaxes in the crisis. And then finally, the falling action, which is called the denouement, happens to kind of tie everything together, and then we have resolution and conclusion at the end. Just a quick review. Okay, exposition. Sometimes it's a prologue, especially you'll see this in Greek tragedy. But for us in Trifles, let's think about it this way. It's information that sets the scene. It tells us that we're in the kitchen of a rural farmhouse in the middle of the winter. We find all that out. We meet the characters. We meet Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Peters, the county attorney, Mr. Peters, who's the sheriff. We also are introduced to two characters who never stepped foot on the stage, Mr. and Mrs. Wright. And we find out what's happened so far in the story. And we remember that exposition can be given at any time during the play. In the case of Trifles, the first one-third of the play is basically exposition. In that one-third of the story, we find out, or of the play I should say, we find out the background of the characters. We find out that Mr. Wright was murdered, that Mrs. Wright's been taken to jail after appearing to be in shock, and she's obviously the suspect that the police are looking to pin the murder on. But there's no motive. So the men have come to the farmhouse to find the motive. The women have come to gather up some of Mrs. Wright's belongings and take them back to her. However, more exposition is revealed as the action of the play itself unfolds. During the play, the women reveal several things. Among them are these: that Mr. Wright was cold and controlling as a husband, that Mrs. Wright, as a young girl, had been happy, social, loved to sing, that through the years of their marriage, Mrs. Wright had been increasingly isolated and suffocated, that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters regret not being friends to Mrs. Wright. Now, one thing that's really important is finding the protagonist. If we know who the protagonist is and we can trace the point at which they were kick-started into action, we can trace where the climax happened to the protagonist, then we'll be able to see a little bit more clearly where that climax actually is. So, in this case, we should ask ourselves three questions. Who is on a journey that the plot's main action revolves around? Who primarily struggles against outside forces to achieve a goal? And when that goal is achieved, does the conflict of the play end? I submit to you that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters fulfill these conditions the best. Normally you don't see more than one protagonist in a story, but remember this play was written in the 1920s, and at this point people were experimenting a lot more with plot structure and ideas, and I think Susan Glaspell intended both of the women to be co-protagonists. Also, if you think about it, the main action that happens on stage revolves around them in the kitchen, what they do and what they find out. So let's say that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are the protagonists. Now, in order to kind of understand the overall arc of the story, I'm going to introduce to you something that I call a statement of dramatic action. It's a very, very simple statement that can be shown as an equation. X represents the protagonist who struggles against Y, some outside force or forces, to achieve a goal which we'll call Z. In this case, we have Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Now, what are they struggling against? Let's think about this a minute. I think there's three things. Mrs. Wright leaves some hidden clues behind. They have their own particular concepts of justice that they struggle with and try to grow from. And they also struggle against the men's demeaning attitudes. So to me, there are three parts to what we would call the antagonist. And finally, what they really decide they want to achieve is how can they protect Mrs. Right? That really becomes the main part, the main goal that the women have. So let's go back and think about it a minute. If Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters want justice for Mrs. Right, the men's demeaning attitudes, first of all, are going to show them that Mrs. Right may not fare so well in a man's world in court. It also shows them that the things that women think about that men don't think are important. So they're really out to get Mrs. Right no matter what. She doesn't stand much of a chance. But on the other hand, murder is murder. And so look at the inner conflicts that the two women go through trying to get to the point where they decide if it's right or wrong to shield Mrs. Right. And finally, Mrs. Right does leave lots of hidden clues. So let's take a look at that again, and here's what it would look like. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters struggle against Mrs. Right's hidden clues, their own concepts of justice, and the men's demeaning attitudes to achieve protecting Mrs. Right. The next screencast that you're going to listen to then is going to show you a little bit more about what the point of attack is and try to take you all the way through to the end of the play.